Automakers and suppliers are investing in electric and autonomous cars as well as mobility services. But AlixPartners says the industry is entering a profit desert because nobody is making money with these technologies. At least not yet. On this week's show, the panel discusses how the industry will have to handle this transition. Underwriting for the production of Autoline This Week has been provided by RSM.
Prepare for challenges specific to your business by working with trusted advisors who help turn obstacles into opportunities. Experience the power of being understood. RSM, Audit, Tax, and Consulting for the Middle Market.
And now, here's your host, John McElroy.
You know, there's going to be a lot of changes coming up in the auto industry in the next decade. Electric cars, autonomous cars, connectivity, mobility services. The future looks bright, but will anybody make any money at it? That's what we're going to get into today because our special guest is Mark Wakefield. He's the co-head of global automotive practice at AlixPartners. Great to have you back on the show.
Thanks very much. Pleasure to be here.
Joining me on the journalist panel today, too, are Jamie Butters from Automotive News and Joe White from Reuters. Always good to have you guys here.
Glad to be here.
So, Mark, let's get into what I'm talking about. You guys at AlixPartners have done this deep dive study, and you're saying that the automotive industry is about to go into a profit desert. And yet, it would seem that on a certain level, lots of excitement, lots of new things, lots of new ways to make money. Why are you saying we're going into a profit desert?
Well, it is a very exciting desert in the sense that we coined a couple years ago, I think 2014, this term CASE, Connected, Autonomous, Shared Mobility, and Electrified. And this is all the things that are not just the evolution of the business, but really incremental new things that are on top of the normal cycle of the next vehicle, even better. And when we looked at that, we said, okay, these are the fancy new things coming. There's a different way of approaching, a smart way of getting ready for that. Those are now happening, whereas particularly connected and electrified are really here, and the investments are here. The autonomous, not quite yet, but they're coming, and the investments are going in now. And so this amount of investment that goes on over the next sort of 5-year period is ahead of big sales and potentially big profits. The big profits aren't really now, though. And that 5-year period, we have to get through that desert of investment before we start really getting any return on this investment.
So, Mark, I mean, at one level, it seems like completely irrational. I mean, I think your numbers are that $225 billion is going to be invested in electrification, and then there's more money going into connectivity and autonomy on top of that. I mean, this is an industry that would sell close relatives to get $10 or $100 a car, and yet they're doing this. It just seems irrational. Is it irrational, or is it really smart, sort of investing for the future and that for once taking the long view, this will all work out in the end? I'm not quite sure I know, based on reading your report, where you stand on that question.
We stand on that it's an existential thing for OEMs and suppliers and the industry to participate and to move the ball forward towards CASE, but you've got to do it smart and careful, and often in a way that's different than the traditional vertical value chain where the OEMs were dominant, instead in much more of a partnership and puzzle piece approach. So it can be done smartly and carefully. It's not a good strategy just to hope it doesn't happen, because whether you believe 5, 10, or 15 years from now, X changes in the industry on connected, autonomous, or shared, or electrified, most everyone believes it is going to happen, more a matter of when. So you do need to participate, and if you wake up 10 years from now with no CASE vehicle, everyone now would believe you were in trouble.
But it really sounds like an awful proposition, right? You have to invest, like you said, hundreds of billions of dollars into something that doesn't have a sure profit, and when it does have one, you might control less of it. right? Is that what
You
you're
may
saying?
control less of it, but it depends on how you play your cards. You may control more of it. And you may have better economics because you've changed from being a commoditized player to something that is more software electronics driven and more IP driven and protective of those profit pools, but not to a degree that you hold back on the opportunity, is a tough balance to do. But it is where the difference between winners and losers will come, is how they navigate through this and how they participate, improve, without just believing that it will come.
So Mark, this report is full of a lot of really fascinating and maybe scary numbers, and one set is that you calculate sort of the powertrain cost of a battery electric vehicle at around $16,000 versus $6,500 for an internal combustion vehicle. And I'm wondering, as you look at what's happening in the industry, alliances like the Volkswagen-Ford deal that was just announced a few days ago and other deals like that, do you see those alliances really changing that math, or changing the math so that there will be profit, there will be an oasis somewhere in the middle of the desert?
Yeah, those deals where you're not trying to have everybody assume that they're going to get 300,000 vehicles out of this program, and instead being able to shift and to have battery conditioning algorithms be done 4 times by 4 consortiums versus 30 times by 30 different players makes a ton of sense. And it's the same argument that has been happening on the powertrain side, but it's never been able to get sort of off zero because there's a big installed base and you could never deal with that. Now these are incremental investments, there's new investments to be put into the ground, and you can take a more logical approach, one that has better industrial logic behind sharing risks and being able to get flexibility out of what you're investing in and scale out of it, plus being able to have the benefit of not having to do the same thing twice in 2 different rooms.
While you brought up the Ford VW deal, which is important on the electric side, that money pit, but on the other one, you've got this Argo structure where it's not Ford's autonomous vehicle unit that VW invested in, it's the company that Ford invested in that VW is investing in. Does that kind of a business model with an outside company being the vehicle rather than wholly owned or a straight up joint ventures, are there advantages to that? Is that an approach that can limit the short term, medium term losses in this industry?
It depends on where your starting point is. There's not a one size fits all. The larger OEMs, the larger suppliers have considerable electronics and software knowledge, need to develop more, and we'll have a tough time transitioning mechanical engineers into electronics or mechatronics into software engineers. And sometimes, particularly with smaller OEMs, it can make sense to partner for some of those skills or do wholesale changes. So I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all on, okay, it's just have an independent company do that, because there's tremendous risks that go along with that too. It's really how you go from point A to point B rather than, oh, there is a winning point B strategy of a structure.
You know, when you talk in terms of a profit desert, that's a disaster for the industry. Certainly it is for the people running the companies, because as you know, if they're not profitable on these investments, they're already getting excoriated today. Investing in traditional technology they do know how to make a profit on, they just don't make enough to satisfy Wall Street. So if you go into a profit desert, that only gets worse. The executives that run the companies, if they can't make these profits, they're all going to get fired. How do you think this is going to play out over the next, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8 years until we get back to maybe a more normal kind of industry?
Well, I think to put it in context, you know, the amount of money going into electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, is about what the OEMs and suppliers spend in 1 year's worth of CapEx and R&D expense. That's 5 years worth of the current AV and EV announced expenses. So the materiality is 1 out of every 5 years of your investment pool is now put aside for something that's not going to return capital immediately and not in the next 5-year window of this profit desert. And so you got to be pretty smart about that, pretty transparent about that, and can keep the market's confidence that you're doing the right thing and you're doing it in a measured way, but you're going to come out the other side of this well.
How do you do that? How do you say, hey, look, don't worry that we're not making any money on this. Just keep our stock price up?
Not overcommitting and doing what you say, but also showing you are making those moves in a very deliberate way, and you're not delaying on decision making. So you're not hoping that the electrified thing is a fad and won't come into play. You're actually addressing it in a smart way. Being transparent and then doing what you say and delivering on it will be a very key one, and very important, because a loss of confidence that someone's not going far enough, or a loss of confidence, wow, you're spending too much and you're ignoring the profitable business you have today that you need to nurture. If you go too far in one of those two ways, it's not going to go well.
Mark, let me ask you, so let's do a thought experiment where you're running a supplier company, or you're a decision maker at a supplier company, and you're looking at this kind of unstable environment and trying to figure out where to put your chips. I mean, it seems like the risks are huge. You either stay committed to internal combustion and you go off into the sunset, you overcommit to electrification, and you're in the middle of the profit desert. I mean, what do you do, or what do you see supplier company executives doing to kind of play the odds on all of this? Because it's got to be really difficult.
It can be, but you've got to be clear-eyed about things are changing. And you sometimes may turn into a business that has really two different looking businesses. But at that juncture point, you have new business that you need to think about in a different way, invest in a more measured milestone way, have different kind of discussions and arrangements with the OEMs to be able to do that in a measured way, because you don't have the confidence, the same degree of confidence of this vehicle will sell that many in 3 years' time on an EV that you might on an existing replacement vehicle. And your investments have to reflect that. At the same time, you can't turtle. You do need to make that change. You do need to put yourself in your company into a new view. If you said, okay, I'm going to invest in the next, these machining centers to do this or this powertrain, and in the past you'd think, okay, I can get 3 cycles of slight modifications out of it. You need to question that now and say, do I really need that? Will I really get that out of it?
Yeah, will you get 3 cycles? Will you get 10 years or 15 years or less, right?
But at the same time, you don't want to put a massive amount of capacity there, building it and hoping the volumes come. So it's a tough one, but it is a manageable one. If you're clear-eyed, you challenge the myths and the sort of traditional thinking of how to approach new business and R&D, but also you make sure there's a profit motivation, a cash flow focus, a transparency on how you see it and how your customers and your suppliers see this business going forward, so that you're not getting over your skis.
Is it perhaps more navigable, this theoretical, one of those cases where it's better to be a supplier than an automaker because you do write a contract, and you know you have a good idea what your revenue is going to be, and you can pick and choose maybe your timing and which projects to be on?
I think the degrees of freedom are obviously much, much higher on an OEM. So the complexity of that is definitely challenging. On a supplier, you don't have as many degrees of freedom. That's also a bit of a scary thing in the sense that you don't control necessarily the success of the whole vehicle, and you have to sign up to amount of capital and being able to capacitize for doing something at a certain volume, whether or not that volume comes. So it's a different challenge. I wouldn't say one is necessarily easier than the other.
And it seems like volume projections in this business have always been, kind of a Ouija board sort of exercise. And it seems like in the case of electric vehicles, it's even more so. I mean, again, from your report, you're looking at sort of average projected sales per entry, per model, of about 14,000 vehicles a year, which is not good.
No.
And I imagine that in discussions between suppliers and OEMs now, there's a lot of disagreement over, okay, we think we're going to sell 100,000. No, you're not. I mean, how do you see that playing out?
It's a tough one. It depends a lot on the dynamics and trust and partnership between a supplier and an OEM. The average sales per battery electric vehicle is now around 10 or 11, and may go to 14 with increases.
That's good news.
Compared to a non-BEV, it's like 90,000 units per on average. So dramatic difference, and yet a lot of OEMs, their baby is the prettiest baby, smartest baby, all this, and so they think it will take a share. And you need a level of optimism and a level of confidence in your product for it to even have a chance at doing well. But there needs to be a pragmatism in how much capital do we really put into this, and those often work in a discussion where there is a high degree of trust and a senior enough level meeting of the minds, where it's a RFP, contractual, back and forth, transactional. Those can go wrong because the guy that overcommits or says he overcommits and then doesn't put capital into the ground isn't actually the best business partner. The one that actually forces the better decision to be happening earlier is the better decision business partner. And so that's a good way through it. It's not an easy way through it, and it's not the typical way we've been working in the past when you've got the replacement part on a vehicle you had in the past.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think this is going to play out in the sense that Tesla's done a very good job of selling electric cars? I think it sells more than everybody else put together, i.e. all the others have failed miserably at selling electric cars. What's it going to take to turn that around?
Fundamentally, the cost of electric vehicles coming down. In our surveys, it's not environmentalism that is the top driver of people
But
wanting them.
we've seen Nissan, for
It's the cost.
example, drop the price of the Leaf to $28,000.
Yes.
Didn't do anything for sales. There was a little blip, and now it's nothing. So I understand what you're saying, that you got to get the cost of the batteries down. Even Tesla has to do that. Nobody's making a profit on these vehicles.
Yeah.
But it's not just getting the cost down to the consumer, the price down to the consumer. There's got to be something else. Tesla clearly has cracked the code. I don't think anybody else has yet.
Well, Tesla has a charging infrastructure, and the numbers 2 and 3 of our survey of reasons why people wouldn't pay an even amount is around charging infrastructure. Number 1 is around range. So none of those are around cost. The concern on cost, though, did go higher in this year's survey, and so people are attuned on the flip side of the higher cost for the same package size, for the same effective vehicle. They're fundamentally paying more now. Some people value that enough to like it. Some brands brand it well and have been very successful at communicating a brand promise and living that brand promise. And others have struggled with it. The challenge right now, though, is fundamentally you've still got costs that are too high. And so it's because of a brand push in some areas. Let's remember, it's 1% of the market, a little more than 1% of the market. It's not substantial at the moment. It's predicted to go higher in the future, but there's, the future being a decade, right? So it's a challenge, and it's a challenge where fundamentally the TCO, the total cost of ownership, has to really be a break even in the majority of segments for it to take off.
So Mark, I think one of the things I would question about your report a little bit, but I want to ask you to talk about it, is everything you're saying makes a lot of sense. It's sort of business-like and rational. The problem is that a lot of the electric vehicle debate is actually affected by politics and policy and feelings about air pollution. I mean, look what's going on in Europe, where they've had a brutally hot summer, lots of air pollution, and now calls for banning internal combustion vehicles in Paris and so on. Yeah. So I'm just wondering how you would advise clients, to say, okay, look, in addition to all these other things, here's how you factor the public policy, sort of political, social risk into these decisions as well.
Yeah. Well, you take somewhat of a bet on what markets are like each other and which ones are not, and which ones do I want to play in? Am I in now? And which ones can I make money in? So you would typically not go for your latest and greatest in a market that doesn't value that technology as much. So you're seeing the Chinese government pushing electric vehicles and continuing to push electric vehicles, and you're seeing Norway and others as the sort of end of the spectrum cases on pushing electric vehicles, and lo and behold, that stick and carrot approach is driving those markets to be much higher. Europe is also now with the diesel, the change in the public's view of diesel, regardless of the engineer's view of diesel, the public's view of diesel is that it's not something I want. And so this change to electrification is now seeing Europe catch up as China doesn't go as heavy on electrification as it has in the past. But you can see these governments doing things that are fairly predictable. They don't change 180 degrees on a dime. The U.S., while it's softened off on its regulatory push, was never the lead horse on that electrification push, absent the sort of California ZEV things, which were in, but then as soon as they were not achieved, were taken out. The Chinese ones have never been, when they weren't achieved, they weren't taken out. It really meant do it.
Yeah, they're putting the pressure on.
And so it's less, sitting here in North America, maybe because of the change of us reducing our requirements and our regulations and not showing the level of carrot that some of the countries are showing. The other countries have either increased, have not modified their long-term view quite so much. Europe's had the diesel change, but their grams per kilometer hasn't really changed as a view. China has moved a bit away from the demand incentives and more to the supply side, but they still have it in their plan to lead in electrification. And so you can make investment decisions based on those.
So the fundamental problem is the cost.
Yes.
They cost too much.
Yeah.
You say there's progress, about 4%. 4% of costs coming out from technology improvements and 7% from scale.
Yep.
So those are like, if you can add those together and you get maybe a 10, 11% per year, maybe it evens out in about 6 years, something like that, like mid-2020s.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure I was reading your numbers right, first of all. But so is that really when America and the rest of we can embrace EVs and have them available even in Midwest states that don't follow the California protocols and all that?
Less so with that, because you still got the range, you still got charging, and again, those were 1 and 2 of the reasons not to.
Right.
So you still got those things, but for an inflection curve point in the leading markets in China and Europe, once you cross that TCO or get near that TCO,
total cost of ownership
point in crossing the curves, then you say, okay, I'm past this part of the S-curve and I'm now turning the corner into a growth part. Doesn't mean that in the US where gas is cheap, where regulatory stick isn't as high, that you pass that curve as fast, but we see it passing faster in China and in Europe.
But I would add, too, that your $6,500 for an internal combustion engine powertrain, that's a pretty high boat internal combustion engine. You're probably talking twin turbo, V8, intercooled, direct injection, variable valve timing.
Yeah.
Because I know for a fact a naturally aspirated 4-cylinder engine is about $1,200.
Yeah.
An automatic on top of that, it maybe adds another $800. You're at maybe $2,000.
Yeah.
So you're talking about a crossover at the upper end of the market in the mid-20s.
You can't necessarily compare an electric motor with an engine. You have to look at the whole powertrain, right? The fuel systems, the evaporators, the whole balance of plant, and put it all together. And then you have to say, this is getting invariably more expensive as an ICE. It depends on the region and segment, 14 to 25% more expensive over that period, whereas the battery electric vehicle powertrain goes down over that period, both by scale and by technology as it goes. So technology way faster than the ICE technology improvement, and the regulatory hurdle on ICEs right now, the European 95 grams per kilometer, that's going to be a real tough one because we've been switching out of diesels into ICE engines, gas engines, and it's sort of flatlined the improvement. So a big jump, and that jump is in cost in an ICE.
So as you look at, back to the desert metaphor, which I really like. As you look at the industries that are standing on the edge of this desert, starting to walk in, do all the parties walk out, Or do you see that at long last there's really going to be a pretty significant consolidation in the industry, either like up front in terms of the number of brands, the number of companies that face consumers, or behind the curtain as Volkswagen or Ford, where they're joining together to produce one set of software for electric vehicles, that kind of thing. I'm just sort of wondering at what point the consolidation really starts to kick in. Or doesn't it? I'm just, what's your view?
It really depends on how people navigate this period, this valley, or this profit desert. Because if you go into it with a very pragmatic plan to get out the other side, that isn't 1 year away from having to stop half your development programs because you run out of money because 1 year you missed it by 1 year, then that's pretty tight. If you've actually got a pretty pragmatic plan that gives you degrees of freedom, allows you to invest as you go, allows you to also pull back as you go or accelerate, and you have the cash balance, you have the current business to get through that, and generating enough cash to get you through that, you come out the other side. But it means play it smart. You can't sit on the current business only and just improve that, and you can't bet the farm on a completely new thing. You have to balance that near and far at the same time and be pragmatic about how much it'll cost going through this, and find ways on partnerships, on other smart ways of how do I participate to make sure that you're selling a current generation, and you're going to have the charging infrastructure, you're going to have the right range, and you're going to have the cost, upfront cost, to be able to compete.
Well, good. With that, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up. So we get through the desert, though, right? In your scenario, at some point.
Yes, everyone believes that there is a future out there, but the navigation of that desert will separate some winners and losers.
Well, good. With that, we're wrapping it up. Mark Wakefield, thanks again for coming on the show. Jamie Butters, Joe White, want to thank you, and of course, I want to thank all of you for having tuned in.
Underwriting for the production of Autoline This Week has been provided by RSM.
Prepare for challenges specific to your business by working with trusted advisors who help turn obstacles into opportunities. Experience the power of being understood. RSM, Audit, Tax and Consulting for the Middle Market.